First of all, thank you for this long introduction. Now I have to meet the expectations. I'm very happy to be here. I will talk about climate and migration with the subtitle Between Compulsion to Move and Freedom to Move. And, well, you will hopefully only understand the subtitle at the end of the talk. But the title certainly already suscitate in your minds pictures and perhaps also some fears. At least it seems to be the case in the media and in many public discussions. I forgot to switch on the mic as usual. Thank you. Shall I start from the beginning? It's okay? Okay. Oh, I take the opportunity to say that. I will speak during about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for discussion. And the discussion can be in English, of course, but also feel free to ask questions in German und natürlich auf Französisch. And second point, I will show you some graphs. I will especially show you many research results, but without any references, simply because I guess we have a very large audience today, so I tried to make my talk as accessible as possible. If you are interested in getting the slides, just write to me, I will send you the documents. If you are interested in any references linked to what I'm going to present, also I'm happy to give you the whole bibliography that you might be interested in. So, back to the topic, images. Images circulating in the media of so-called climate refugees. Recently, a poll among 23,000 persons in 20 countries of the world asked the question about future crises. And for 63% of the respondents, we were at the beginning of a climate migration crisis. So it is definitely a fear. I don't know if it is your fear, but it is a fear. And of course, one could say it's a good fear because it stimulates the fight against climate change. But at the same time, I'm sure you understand it is also a fear that might be used by those who simply want to build walls against migrants. So it's a two-sided fear, and this simply is an indication that some fact-checking on the issue of climate refugee is necessary. And that's exactly what I'm going to do today, fact-checking. Simple question I'm going to try to answer is, are we going to see increased global migration caused by climate change? And you will see, but only at the end of my talk, that there are some links with the issue of freedom. So my talk will be in 4 parts. First, just a few words about history. Then I'm going to go systematically through the different aspects of the links between climate change and population mobilities. Cyclones, temperature rise and droughts, sea level rise. These are the most central direct links that can be assessed. But of course, there are also indirect links, such as the links between climate change conflicts and migration. And more generally, of course, the impact of climate change on economic prosperity and the consequences on migration. And I'm going to conclude at the end. So, starting with history, we have actually innumerable examples in the distant or closer past of movements of people which were linked with change in the environment. Such links have been studied quite extensively by geographers of the past. But when I say of the past, it is mainly of the 19th century and not the 20th century. Just to quote two of them. Friedrich Ratzel, geographers among you certainly know that person, 1882. Climate is one among two main drivers of migration in history, the other one being political turmoils. Or Ellen Churchill Semple, the chair of the American Association of Geographers at the beginning of the 20th century. The search for better land, milder climate, and easier conditions of living starts many a movement of people. I'm not going to go into those studies. What is interesting is that that topic nearly disappeared from the interest of the scholars on migration of the 20th century. And I have documented that history in a paper for those who are interested. Basically, one of the reasons is that during the 20th century, a very strong idea, at least up to the end of the 20th century, was that modernity implies a decreasing impact of nature on societies. And in that context, migration linked to the environment were considered as, to quote a famous migration scholars of the 1950s, primitive migration. These were the migrations of the primitive people, not of the modern civilizations. And during the 20th century, when migration studies really had a very dynamic theoretical and empirical contribution to knowledge, this led to really the disappearance of that topic. I will not go into that, but this is good to keep in mind. Because of course, at the end of the 20th century, suddenly the environment came back not only in connection with migration, but in connection with the whole aspect of human life. And this, of course, especially linked to climate change. One of the first to quote the word environmental refugees was Essam El-Hinawi, who was a UN scholar who published a report on soil degradation in Eastern Africa, entitled precisely Environmental Refugees. On that basis, some other scholars of the end of the century, especially Norman Myers, made some predictions without any very sounding methodological empirical foundation, but leading to, for example, this famous 150 million environmental refugees for the end of the 21st century, which you still find in some press report from time to time popping up back on the in some articles. So a reappearance of the issue, again in a context of climate change. This is the famous graphic of the rise in temperature. As you can see, we have really measured a rise in temperature since 1970s, and we are currently about 1 degree above the mean temperature 8050, 9050. You know the forecasts of the IPCC. We don't know where we will be in 50 years, but between probably 2 and 4 degrees. So it's in that context that the issue reappeared on the agenda. And this led to a huge number of scientific publications on not only the topic of climate change, but the very topic of the links between migration and climate change. Walter has mentioned the CLIMIC database. We systematically archive all scientific publications on that topic in this database at the University of Neuchâtel. It is open access for anyone who would like to use that database. We have currently about 2,200 references on the topic, and the trend has been on the rise since more or less the 1980s, when precisely El-Hinawi coined the term environmental refugee. what does this graph mean? It means that currently we have a total of about 200 peer-reviewed scientific publications a year on the topic, and about 100 empirical studies which are using empirical material, so quite a lot. And it's on that basis that I will talk today, because we have really important material to make synthesis, meta-studies, and to know better about the phenomenon. So that was the few words I wanted to say about the history of the debate. Now let's get into the results. Regarding first the direct links between climate change and migration, what is the forecast of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Well, it forecast three main possible drivers of migration: cyclones, temperature and droughts, sea level rise. Let's have a look one by one at those three aspects. Cyclones first. What is the forecast? The forecast, as you probably know, is an increase in intensity, not an increase in frequency for complex physical atmospheric reasons, but an increase in intensity. That, of course, leads to destruction of habitats and flooding in mostly tropical regions of the world. But the link, on the basis of the existing studies, between such events and long-distance, long-term migration is constantly weak. Not because people are not affected, people are severely affected, and people will be more and more affected in the future. But victims are poor, victims are not mobile. The most affected are precisely the less mobile, and in addition, they plan to go back as soon as possible. When a village in Bangladesh is destroyed by a cyclone, most people do want to come back and reconstruct. Of course, a certain number might migrate, but those who migrate will majoritarily migrate over short distances. Some might go up to the capital, but it's a minority. And this is important. This is a bit a surprise regarding this image of floods of refugees that might head toward North America or Europe in the context of climate change. We have many studies which confirm that. Recently, one study showed that extreme flooding in Bangladesh has been inversely associated with internal and international out-migration of population. Why? Because precisely populations were trapped in place. And you can see already the possible link with the issue of freedom that I will address at the end of my talk. So, first phenomenon, cyclones, perhaps first surprise for some of you. The same can be said about temperature rise and drought. Here, the forecast of the IPCC are gloomy, definitely. In many parts of the world, there will be an increased frequency and intensity of droughts. It's true that in some part of the world, the situation might improve, at least during a certain number of decades, but overall, at the level of the world, we have a fear of an aggravation of the situation. And it's true also that we have striking examples in the past of desperate, if you want, mostly internal to countries, drought migration. But nevertheless, for example, in the Sahel has been extensively documented. There have been several droughts in the Sahel in the 1970s, in the 1980s. The issue is not to know if it is linked or not with climate change. It's a kind of historical analog to learn about the future of such links that we use. No systematic link, because if you modelize those migration, if you look at all the factors that have been driving those migration, you realize that the partial correlation specifically linked to the environment and to the climate are rather weak in comparison with other factors that are driving migration. We really have here a phenomenon of multi-causality and of political, economic, social variables that are much more important than the environmental variables. In Mali, for example, a country where a migration system was established for a long time, at the end of the 20th century, the droughts led to an increase in local migration, those kind of desperate migrations that I mentioned, but a decrease of long-distance migration. Why? Simply because migration is an investment. For a household to send a member abroad, especially as it was the case in some regions of Mali to France, was an investment. When households were affected by the droughts, they had not the money to invest in migration, and migration decreased. So here again, perhaps a surprise, but a quite consensual conclusion of existing research. Third phenomenon that I have mentioned, sea level rise. Of course, regarding sea level rise, things are a bit different because it's irreversible. You can come back and reconstruct after a cyclone. If your house is destroyed by sea level rise, then it's definitive. You have to move. And it's true that many people do live at very low altitude currently in the world. With our colleagues from Columbia University, we have produced that map of the population living in so-called low elevation coastal zone, namely technically less than 10 meters above the sea. You might say that 10 meters is quite a lot, considering that the forecasts for sea level rise from the IPCC do mention 2-3 meters by the end of the century. But it has to be taken into account that sea level rise also implies erosion, also implies salinization, and has many impacts much further away than the true level of the sea. That's why also consensually one consider low elevation coastal zones as 10 meters above the sea. 600 million people do currently live at such altitudes all around the world, as you can see on that map, with some significant concentration. These are absolute numbers. So the circle is proportional to the absolute numbers of people living at those altitudes. You can see that, of course, Southeast Asia is on the forefront, but there are many other parts of the world where significant population might be affected. The west coast of Africa, Egypt, the delta of the Nile counts huge population, and of course also countries in Europe or the United States. Don't look for Switzerland. We have no one at less than 10 meters altitude. But the Netherlands have many people, of course, under that level. That's not anecdotal because nobody fears the climate refugees from the Netherlands, usually. Why? Simply because we know that the Netherlands have the financial power for centuries, actually, to allow people to live under the level of the sea. And this is an important aspect of this issue of sea level rise. It might force people to move, if there are not enough financial means to prevent them from moving. So it's not a direct link that might force people to move. It's, again, a complex, multi-causal phenomenon that will affect the populations. But this is a serious threat. If you take, instead of 10 meters, 1 meter, you still have 150 million people living under 1 meter. So this is really an important issue. Here is just to illustrate the threat, a picture I took last year in Saint-Louis in Senegal. Saint-Louis is among those cities who are really on the forefront regarding erosion, and this house has been really cut in two by a tempest due to the sea level rise and due to the fact that the house was located on sand, actually. So a serious threat, an irreversible phenomenon, no possible return. But again, we are here mostly talking about local displacement. Many people in Saint-Louis have already moved or have been relocated, hopefully 100 meters from the sea. In some cases, much more than 100 meters, which is a problem for fishermen, for example, who cannot sustain their livelihoods if they are relocated 10 kilometers from the sea. But in any case, these are local moves. This does not mean that among those people affected, there are not some who are candidates for long-distance migration, but at least the link is more complex than what might be expected. And the process is slow. The process allows for adaptation, beach feeding, walls of protection. Again, if the financial means are there, it might be possible at least to mitigate the impact of sea level rise on population. In that context, we have more to do here with an issue of protection, with an issue of relocation, so mobility, but not migration. If you define migration as a move that covers a certain distance, then you can make the difference between local mobilities and migration, which would mean migrating to the capital or to a city or further away. So that's for the direct links. As you see, in the three cases, I do not, and research do not deny the possible migration consequences of climate change, but the image of a mechanical process leading to migration is complexified. As you can imagine, things even turn more complex if you look, as I will do, at the indirect links. I will address two of these indirect links. First, the link between climate change conflicts and migration, and second, the link between climate change, economic prosperity or recession, and migration. Starting with conflict, you might have heard, because this has been also very present in the press, the thesis of some observers, among them very highly ranked international politician, according to which the migration crisis of 2015 might be the first climate migration crisis. It is true that since 2011, there has been a drought, severe drought, in the so-called Fertile Crescent, which covers significant part of Syria. And you might have heard of a very famous paper that was published in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the US National Academy of Science, by Kelly Mortadi and colleagues, which made the headlines of the New York Times in 2017 with exactly that idea, that the Syrian crisis is a climate crisis. Well, this is not completely unfounded. It is an interesting study. It resonates with other more recent studies which are showing some levels of correlation between temperature changes and asylum requests lodged in Europe. There is also one famous study that is bringing this argument for those who are interested. But nevertheless, this is a highly controversial issue. There is a real scientific debate on that issue with many publications who are debating on that issue. And I can say that currently a majority of the researchers do actually reject, or at least strongly minimize, the impact of the drought or the climate change signature, if you want, in Syria on the crisis and on, of course, the consequence in terms of refugees. To use the same vocabulary as before, the partial correlation are very weak. There are other variables that are much more important if we want to understand the Syrian conflict than the droughts in the eastern part of the region. You can imagine what factors are at play here: political factors, economic factors, geopolitical factors are much more important. So definitely Syrian refugees are not refugees. Again, this does not mean that in certain circumstances climate change might have an impact on conflicts, might play a role on conflicts, might be a threat multiplier. If you have a situation, a very volatile political situation, and in addition there is a drought, in addition there is a scarcity of resources, in addition there is a drop in agricultural productivity, that could lead to a conflict that would have not occurred without that specific climatic contribution. But this is not to say that this is the main driver of the phenomenon. But this is where one has to be very careful in our interpretations. And this is also valid for the other studies that are mentioned, which are measuring the link between various environmental variables and the number of asylum requests lodged in especially Europe. Other researchers have shown that, again, there are many other variables that are more important. Again, the key word here, multi-causality. So that's what I wanted to say about conflicts. Then the last indirect link that I wanted to look at is much broader, in the sense that, of course, one might argue that if climate change has an impact on economic prosperity, then there will be an impact of economic migration. So we're not talking here about climate refugees, people who have been directly affected by climate change and have to flee their home to search for shelter, but we are talking about the global migration and the global impact of the economic prosperity on migration. And of course, that's probably one of the most important issues, because even if, as I have shown, the direct links are weak, one could perfectly argue that the most important impact might go through that specific economic channel. Nowadays in the world, economic migration, even if it's always difficult to make a clear-cut difference between economic migration and migration which have more to do with political issues, there is no clear-cut distinction. But nevertheless, one can say that economic migration are the vast majority of migration currently in the world. So in order to assess that aspect, we can start on fairly solid grounds, because it is, again, very consensual to say, very unfortunately, that climate change will have a negative global impact on the economy. There are very precise assessments. It's, of course, extremely difficult to forecast the consequences of climate change on the economy, as it is difficult to forecast the consequences of climate change on migration. But for example, Swiss Re, the research department of Swiss Re, has published recently a very detailed series of forecasts, country by country, of the consequences of climate change. And overall, this is clearly negative. It's true that some countries, at least during perhaps 50 or 100 years, might be the winners. Russia, for example, or Canada. But most countries will very, very soon be affected. And of course, most of all the countries who are relying on agriculture, because the productivity of agriculture is really directly impacted by a rise in temperature. Again, not everywhere, but in most parts of the world. One can always say that we're going to discover new fertilizers, but this is a bet on the future. If you maintain constant the rise of progress of fertilizers, you also find that there might be a decrease in agricultural productivity. So solid grounds, because we know that the impact will be negative. But that does not mean that there's going to be more migration. Because migration, economic migration, are a very, very complex phenomenon, again. And those of you who are familiar with migration studies might have heard of the quite famous inverted U curve. What is the inverted U curve? Sorry, that's the part of my talk which asks for some ability at abstraction. U curve is the link between economic development and migration. And that's what you see on that graph. When economic development rise, when GDP rise, if you want, during a first phase, there is an increase in migration. And only after a certain threshold is reached, there is a decrease. Of course, this is not consensual. We cannot put numbers on that. I cannot tell you when is the inflection points, but there are many historical examples of that inverted U curve. Just to make it a little bit more vivid, take the example of Niger. Niger has a very, very low immigration rate, among the lowest. Why? Because people do not have the assets to migrate. Niger is there. Nigeria is much more advanced in terms of GDP and has a much higher immigration rate. Somewhere there is a threshold, and some countries have gone through that threshold. Think about Portugal. Portugal was a major immigration country and turned into not an immigration country, but at least turn into a decreasing emigration countries about a decade ago. Switzerland also can be said as having gone through that thresholds between during the 20th century. Between the 19th century, Switzerland was an emigration country, and although there are still Swiss people who are leaving the country, we turned into an emigration country. That's emigration. Remember, that's emigration. Immigration is different. The relation between GDP and immigration can also be put on a graph, but it's linear, more or less. The more you have prosperity, the more you need migrants. That's also the case in Switzerland. So that's not very complicated. But if you look at emigration, that's how things look. And now you can understand why it is complex to assess the impact of climate change. Let's imagine that all countries of the world go backward in that graph, wherever they are. A country like Portugal will send more migrants. They will go that way, the blue line. But other countries, for example, Nigeria, certainly will send less migrants if you accept the idea of that inverted U curve. So the consequence of that, sorry about that, is that it's nearly impossible, actually, really, to make a prognosis about the indirect impact of climate change on migration, even if we know that there is a negative impact on prosperity. And if you look at the literature, you will see that although many quite sophisticated models have been built to quantify precisely this impact, the results are very contradictory. There is a very recent paper which basically says that climate change will diminish migration worldwide because of a lack of assets to migrate. That's the argument. Other papers are more nuanced and are forecasting an increase in migration. But in any case, it's not a huge number of new migrants, precisely because of that complexity. So the forecast says about, perhaps 3, 4, 5% of immigrants more toward OECD country, to take the example of one of those papers. So again, a very stimulating, very interesting result, but without a very clear-cut conclusion for or against an increase in migration. So while I'm at the end of this panorama of the different aspects of the links between climate change and migration, I'm also slowly reaching the 45 minutes that I have promised. So this leaves me some time for a short conclusion, and then we can discuss on those topics. And this leads me to the subtitle of my talk, Between Compulsion to Move and Freedom to Move. Just to make a quick recap of the messages that I've tried to send you, climate change will negatively impact on populations' livelihoods worldwide. That is absolutely clear. Some will be forced to move, but mostly on short distances and for limited, and often for limited periods of time. So not necessarily migration as I have defined it. And it's true that most people simply do not want to move further than absolutely necessary. And this statement is also important regarding migration in general. Some people, especially here in Europe, do think that the whole world has just one idea, migrating to Europe. This is completely wrong. I don't know many countries, but the countries I know, especially in Western Africa, testify of that. It's true that among young people, there are significant numbers of people who are dreaming of Europe. That's an important issue, but it's not the majority. Many people simply want to stay and are not dreaming of moving to Europe. This is also the case for people affected by climate change. If they can stay, if they can live in their village with their traditional way of life, that's what they will prefer. Other people do not have the freedom to move, and that's the issue of freedom. Not the freedom to move because moving either is too costly for them or because of migration policies that prevent them from doing so. One of the reasons also why we do not expect huge number of migrants is that we have a world where migration is strictly controlled. It's true that it's impossible to stop migration. It's a nonsense. Trying to build walls against migrants is a nonsense. But that does not mean that migration is not controlled and that those controls have no impact. Migration is strictly controlled, and this makes a big difference. If we had no migration controls in the world today, things would look quite different, despite the fact that only a minority wants to move, etc., as I said. So it's in that context that we can think about freedom and migration, especially because there is one last research result that I haven't mentioned yet, and this is perhaps the most important to keep in mind at the end of the talk. This research result has found its way up to the last IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Properly supported, migration as an adaptation to climate change can reduce exposure and socioeconomic vulnerability. If you think about that sentence, about that result, you will immediately realize that it takes migration in a completely different way as my point of departure. We are not talking here as migration as the negative problematic consequence of climate change that is to be feared, but we see migration as a possible response to climate change. And this U-turn is very, very important and interesting. What does it mean concretely? It means that what has been witnessed by many researchers around the world is that when a household under pressure due to environmental change can send perhaps one member in a city or abroad, and when that member can transfer some money or some knowledge or whatever to its origin village, then the village is in a better position to face the climate change. Concretely, it can be, for example, building dikes against sea level rise with the remittances from immigrants. Or it can be to shift agricultural production toward less sensitive culture, a culture less sensitive to salinization, for example, or build hurricane shelters or whatever. So migration can be the cure. If we accept that important research result, then allowing affected populations some freedom of movement could actually be part of the multifaceted response of the international community to the plight of those mostly affected by climate change. And this is not to say that an undifferentiated open door, open border policy is realistic in a near future. But it is to say that working on migration agreements, on mobility agreements also at local levels, fostering development through migration could be a part of the response to climate change. In any case, fears of climate change should not fuel fears of floods of migrants. Climate migration should be de-dramatized. That's also a message I would like you to keep at the end of this talk. And to close the talk, I will just quote an anthropologist that you might know, those of you who are studying anthropology, namely Noel Salazar, who in a paper entitled On Imagination and Imaginaries, Mobility and Immobility, and his paper by saying the ultimate freedom is not situated in mobility as such, but in the choice whether one wants to be mobile or not. The idea is that this choice should be and could be offered to a certain extent to those most affected by climate change. And that's my final message. Thank you very much.